Hello and welcome to this week's episode of The Giant Pod with me, Andy Wrintmore. This week's guest is Dr Suzi Gage. She's a psychologist and epidemiologist. She's a senior lecturer at University of Liverpool. She is the host of the smash hit podcast Say Why to Drugs that is co-hosted by Scroobius Pip, as also part of his Distraction Pieces network. She's the author of the book Say Why to Drugs. What do we talk about? Trigger warning, content warning first of all, I guess. We talk about drugs, we talk about alcohol, we talk about mental health, we talk about addiction. So please be warned going into this one that is the topics that we are discussing. We talk about socio-economics, we talk about politics surrounding drugs, we talk about very data-driven points, we talk about gateway drugs, we talk about MDMA, we talk about many drugs in their scientific forms. There's lots of myths dispelled, lots of facts, no fiction. I think you're going to really like this. I really enjoyed it. It was such a treat to sit down with someone so knowledgeable in their field and pick their brains for an hour, or just over an hour. It was a real privilege. I really enjoyed this, if you couldn't tell. So here it is. Suzi Gage. Hi, it's me, Andy, again. Just want to remind you, if you want to help this show grow and you don't want to spend any money, there's some ways that we can do this free of charge. If you leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, that really helps. If you leave a review on whatever you're listening to this on, that really helps. Like, subscribe, tell a friend. That's really important to tell a friend. If you want to follow us on social media, that also helps. The handle is @TheGiantPod. That's for Twitter and Instagram. That's enough from me. Back to the episode. Enjoy. Okay, cool. Yeah, just email that one through when we're done with it. But, how are you?
Yeah, good. I'm quite tired today. This is my 6th Zoom of the day.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh.
I managed to fit in some lunch, but I'm definitely flagging now. So I'm just trying to perk myself up a bit.
Right. Now, what do you use to perk yourself up? Because I've probably listened to, I'd say 5 or 6 hours worth of your podcast in the last 2 days to prepare for this. And there's quite a lot of chat about caffeine. Caffeine comes up. So what do you use to sort of perk yourself up? You're not against these things, or?
No, I'm not against anything. I'm just interested in what we know about the evidence. But in terms of at the moment, so I'm 8.5 months pregnant right now.
Yes.
So I've been avoiding caffeine during my pregnancy. The evidence around that's not great. I think a little bit of caffeine is absolutely fine, but I've just not been... I've moved on to the decaf, basically.
Right.
So at the moment, all I can really do is like a nice cold glass of water, basically, which is really hitting the spot.
Yeah.
And some Gaviscon, which helps.
Does Gaviscon have caffeine in it?
No, it's just because of pregnancy, you have constant heartburn. So.
Oh, fun. Yeah. Sounds great. Yeah. So thanks for agreeing to be on the show. I've been loving it actually the last couple of days. As I said, I listened to about 5 or 6 hours of it, and I do love how it's sort of there's no judgment surrounded with it's just the science, and I think that's really cool. I'm a musician myself, and there's always jokes going around about, like, to write this EP we're gonna have to go and do acid in the desert or something. We're always like joking about that one. Obviously, we haven't done it, but what do you think that sort of stuff does for musicians? I was just listening to one when you came on the Zoom. I had to pause it, so I haven't finished it. But it's you with a panel of people, and you're actually just digging into musicians and sort of psychedelia and things like that.
Yeah, I really loved that episode. We did it as part of a music festival called Smithdown Road Festival that happens just on the road I live on in Liverpool. And yeah, so we had some musicians and some scientists on the panel as well, and a music journalist. So it was a really interesting group of people, and we talked a bit about this link between drugs and creativity that lots of people say, oh yeah, the drugs really help with the creativity, but actually it's really difficult to know kind of in what direction that relationship is it that drugs make you more creative, like psychedelics make you more creative or whatever, cannabis, or is it that people who are more creative or have a certain personality type are also more likely to try these drugs because they've got a curious mind, right. And so they want to know what a psychedelic experience is like because that appeals to their particular personality type. So actually saying that the drugs help the creativity, I'm not convinced myself. I think, and there's lots of effects of drugs that can really hinder creativity as well.
Yeah.
And recently I was on a podcast called Your Own Personal Beatles, and we were talking about the Beatles' relationships with drugs as well, and talking about sort of John Lennon and saying, well, maybe acid helps, but it also helps to be John Lennon if you're going to write these amazing songs, Yeah. I think that's kind of the important bit, is the John Lennon bit rather than the psychedelics or whatever else.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely feel like there's probably, if you're a musician, you're probably a predisposition to be more open anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a lot to do with it.
And of course, if you've had 50 years of Rolling Stone magazine with Jimi Hendrix and the Grateful Dead and Janis Joplin and the Beatles and Dylan, and everyone goes, and then we tried LSD and then it all changed, and then the colours come in, the sitars come through, and everything gets way more sort of, well, on the surface it seems more creative, but maybe it's not any more creative, just different.
Well, also there's such an expectation effect as well. Like if you've been told enough times that that's what's going to happen, then you're kind of predisposed to feel like that. And we definitely see that with substances like psychedelics, that if people have very strong preconceptions of what their experience is going to be like, it's going to be more likely to be like what they're expecting it to be like.
Right.
If that makes sense. Like the type of the mood that we're in and the environment that we're in when we take a substance, it's called set and setting. It has such a huge impact on the type of intoxication experience you have for any drug. I mean, that's true of alcohol as well. So people listening to this may not have tried an illicit drug, but I'm going to guess that a lot of people who listen to this will have had alcohol. And we all know that how you're feeling before you start drinking has a big impact on your experience that evening when you go out, for example. Like if you've
Absolutely.
had a bad day and you think, oh, I really need a drink, it's going to help me feel better. It might help you feel better to begin with, the first one or two, but it might then end with you sort of crying in the loos at the end of the night or feeling awful, because how you're feeling is going to really impact on the experience that you have.
Yeah, I try to only drink to celebrate or to enhance a good time. If I'm having a bad time, luckily I don't have too many bad times. I mean, I don't know, it's all subjective in how the individual deals with what life throws at them, I guess, as well. But I'm quite blessed that I'm very rarely in what I would call like a shit state or something. Do you know what I mean? But if I am, so maybe if I've had a breakup or something, you feel a bit heartbroken, whatever, a bit down on something, the last thing I do is drink, because I just don't feel like that leads you to make any good decisions. You're spending money, you're wasting money on not a good time. And you're going to feel even worse the next day. And you can run away from the reality, maybe, probably not with alcohol very much, unless you really go for it. But then when you wake up the next day, you're in exactly the same place that you were 12 hours before. I
think it's really easy to develop a negative relationship with alcohol if you start using it to try and help, because as you say, it's only a very short-term fix. The next day you're going to feel worse, so maybe the next day will be more of a struggle, so you'll need more alcohol at the end of the day, and then the next day will be even more of a struggle, so you need more. And when you start to build that kind of a relationship with a substance, that's what's associated with all the sort of, or with more risks in terms of both the heaviness of your use and also the impact that it might have on your longer term mental health as well.
Yeah, I just see it as a very sort of short term. Yeah, as you said, it's a short term. Yeah. But I don't even know if it's a fix. But it's all up to the individual, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, some people definitely sort of swear by it. And for things like social anxiety, of sort of, if you're going to a party and you don't know anyone, it's so much easier to talk to people after you've had a drink than it is if you go completely stone cold sober, particularly if you're quite a shy or anxious person anyway. And I think lots and lots of people use alcohol in that way. So we do kind of rely on it to some extent, and maybe that's not a particularly healthy way to behave, but it's something that an awful lot of us do.
Yeah, a social lubricant.
Exactly.
I think they call it, which is a great term. So would you consider yourself to be an expert now after the years of doing podcasts and research? Because I've got some notes here. It says you're a psychologist and an epidemiologist, which, so I guess the psychology comes into the addiction realm, but you're not necessarily talking about addiction within your say why to drugs. You're actually just talking about drugs as chemical compounds, I guess, aren't you? As the raw scientific.
Yeah.
So how did you come into this realm?
So my day job, I guess, is that I work at the University of Liverpool. I'm a senior lecturer in the psychology department, and I teach medical students, and I also do my own research. And the research that I'm interested in is understanding the relationship between substance use and mental health. So it's actually less about addiction and it's more about substance use more broadly, because the vast majority of people who use recreational drugs, be they legal or illegal, don't suffer from addiction, don't necessarily have a problematic relationship with that substance. They might use it every so often. So I'm kind of interested in the spectrum of drug use, not just the sort of far end where people have developed problematic relationships with substances. But what we do see is that substance use is related to increased rates of poorer mental health. But what I'm interested in is trying to understand, well, what does that mean? Because that could mean a couple of things. It could mean that the substance causes an increased risk, but it could also mean that people with poor mental health might be more likely to turn to a substance, maybe because it alleviates some of their symptoms, or even just gives them a bit of an hour or two of sort of respite from feeling how they feel to get into a different mind state. That
Right.
might be helpful. Or it could be that something that happens earlier in life, like sort of, I don't know, the relationships you have when you're a child or during your adolescence, maybe if you experience difficulties as a child, difficult home environment, all sorts of different possible reasons, that maybe that influences both your likelihood to use substances and your risk of poor mental health. So actually the link you see between the two is just an artifact of this earlier thing that's happened to you. So my research is trying to kind of unpick all those, and it's incredibly complicated, really difficult sort of associations to unpick. So I would say kind of I'm an expert on that, I guess. And then thinking about what we know about different recreational drugs, some of that is my research. So I do a lot of research around alcohol, cannabis, tobacco, but some of the other substances that I've talked about in the podcast, that's been kind of me going and finding that stuff out, sort of not so much as part of my day job, but as part of like this stuff that I've been doing alongside it, like writing science blogs and making the podcast and writing a book as well.
How do you fit it all in? How do you have a time management strategy? Because I wear a few hats, and I do find I have ADHD, and I do find that when I'm on the momentum path, it's easier. I just had to do a bit of isolating because I thought I'd been in touch with someone who had COVID or had a positive, and I had to then, I'm okay, I'm good, I got a negative test. But I found that all my momentum like stopped. And I've gone back into like bad habits of like sleeping in a bit and like maybe looking at my phone too much. And I'm really glad to be on this podcast actually, because I'm actually finally doing something. But it's before that I felt like time management was becoming really important, with having to juggle all the responsibilities and be effective within all of them. So how do you do this while being heavily pregnant as well?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's definitely sometimes is trickier than others. But when I started the podcast, and I also started science writing, was when I was a PhD student. So I was very much entirely in control of my own time. I tried to do a 9 to 5 day working on my PhD, but you can be really flexible when you're a student. I'm sure people know what it's like. And there's a lot of work to do for a PhD, but you're very much working by yourself quite a lot. So managing your own time. And as I then got further through my career, I did some sort of post-PhD research, and then I got a lectureship. And the sort of further along I got, the more difficult it was to try and keep the stuff that I was really enjoying doing, like the podcast and the science writing, going alongside my job. But I was really lucky because there's funding you can apply for to do public engagement with science. And actually, I was really lucky. I was able to get a public engagement fellowship from the Wellcome Trust. And that's been really helpful over the past year and a half of actually having built into my day job. This kind of thing now counts as part of my day job. So that's really, really helpful. But yeah, otherwise it's like, I mean, I like being busy. I've played in lots of bands as well. So I've always managed kind of doing multiple things at once.
Wow.
So I'd much rather be busy every evening than sitting at home on the sofa every evening. Having said that, right now, when I'm sort of a couple of weeks away from my due date of my pregnancy, I'm loving my sofa.
Right.
So in a way, lockdown came at the right time for me personally, because I've definitely found myself a lot more tired than usual. And so I found lots of things about the lockdown really, really difficult. But one good thing about it is because I'm working at home, it means that when I do need to go and have a sit down or a lie down, I can do that for half an hour, and then I can come back to another meeting or to finish off some work that I was doing or that kind of thing. So I'm trying to find the silver linings where I can.
So what kind of music do you play? What do you do?
I play keyboards and I sing, although since I moved to Liverpool, I haven't been in a band since then. I had to leave the band that I was in Bristol when I moved up here, which I was really sad about.
Oh.
But yeah, so I've been in all sorts of different kinds of bands. But the reason I moved to Bristol in the first place was because the rest of my band lived there. So yeah.
What was your band called?
That band was called You and the Atom Bomb. And yeah, then I've been in a band called Gliss Gliss. I've been in a Goblin covers band. So Goblin are this 1970s Italian horror soundtrack band. So they did the soundtrack to films like Dawn of the Dead and Suspiria and that kind of thing. So we covered a lot of their songs. That was a really, really fun band to be in. And it also really improved my keyboard playing because their parts are really complicated.
Yeah. I'm recording this from Frome, which isn't too far away from Bristol. I'm sure you've probably been to Frome.
I have, yes.
But yeah, we've played Bristol a whole bunch. What's your favourite venue in Bristol?
Oh, that's a good question. At the moment, I would say it's probably the Exchange. I used to really love the Croft. I used to really love the Junction. I don't know if you ever played the Junction. It was
I don't think so.
On Stokes Croft.
Right.
And it's a really tiny little dive bar, and it all had tables with skeletons painted on it, and yeah, it was great. It was great. Mother's Ruin, I really love.
Mother's Ruin, yeah. Stag and Hounds.
Oh yes, love the Stag. My friends got married at the Stag and Hounds.
Really?
Yeah.
That's
well, I had their
amazing.
reception there.
Bristol's awesome. I love Bristol.
Yeah. Me too. I miss it a lot.
Do you go back often? I guess you haven't
when
really.
I can, haven't been for a while, but yeah, because I've still got lots of collaborators at the uni there as well, and also loads of friends through music. So yeah, I do try and go back when I can.
And it was in Bristol that you first met Scroobius Pip, right?
Yes, that's right. Well, I mean, it was on Twitter where I first met him, I guess.
Okay, so how did that go down?
Well, he was coming down to, I think, Real World Studios, which Peter Gabriel's studios just outside Bristol. I think they're in Box, are they?
Yes, they are.
He was doing some, I don't know exactly what, but he tweeted saying, I'm going to be down in the Southwest. I'm looking for people to come on my podcast. So he makes this podcast Distraction Pieces where he interviews just people he thinks are interesting and has kind of long conversations with them. And he just asked for recommendations of people in the Southwest who he should get on his podcast. And someone suggested Huey from the Fun Loving Criminals, and someone suggested me.
Yeah.
And Huey was busy. So.
Huey is a friend of mine, and I know he's always busy because I'm trying to get him on the goddamn pod. Huey used to live in Frome. Yeah, we've got some history. It's cool, but yeah, that's a stroke of luck then that he was busy.
It was a massive stroke of luck, and it was lovely that someone suggested me to Pip, and that he was then interested enough to follow it up. So he sent me a message. He came round to my house, and we recorded a conversation, and I kind of told him about the research that I do and about being a woman in science, and we had quite a big conversation. But I also mentioned this idea that I had for a podcast about drugs. And he really liked the idea. Partly I mentioned it to him because I'd had the idea for ages and I'd just done nothing with it. I'd found it really difficult to get started. So I thought, if I mention this on his podcast and thousands of people listen to it, then I have to do it.
That's very smart.
And it turns out that was a good move.
Very good move.
Because, not only did I have to do it, but also he said, oh, that's a really great idea. You should call it Say Why to Drugs. I was like, oh, that's a really good name. Because I'd been really struggling to think of a name.
Yeah.
But I guess he does have a way with words. That's kind of his job.
He does,
so,
yeah. My introduction to Scroobius Pip was via the Dan Lassac versus Scroobius Pip album Angels, probably about 10 years ago now. And that is typically not a kind of music that I regularly listen to. But there was something about his words that were like, no, this is fine, I'll listen to this because it was the only some of the only electronic music in my audio diet at that time, and it was just the words that kept bringing me back. It's just great. But I've not met Pip or had him on the show, but one day. So what did being on the Distraction Pieces Network do for you? Because I know he gets something like 4 million listeners or something like that, isn't it? It's like he's a crazy listenership.
Yeah, I think he's a popular boy, but it's fantastic being part of a network. And so the network was basically he was just about to start it when we had our conversation. So he said, you should make this podcast and you can do it as part of the network if you want. And then because he also agreed to be on the podcast too, so what I'd been doing up till that point is interviewing researchers about their work. And I wasn't a very good interviewer at that point. I'd never really done it before. I didn't really know what I was doing. And the conversations were just really dry. And it was no fault of the researchers. It was me not asking them very good questions.
Right.
But because Pip said he would be on the podcast, he's like, you could be the expert and I'll be an interested but non-expert friend and we can just have a conversation. Yeah. And it's so much more engaging to listen to when you can make a podcast in that way, because if it was just me kind of reeling out the evidence about a particular drug, it would be quite dull. It would be quite dry. But because he was able to talk about either his own experiences, or if I said something that was too complicated, he'd be able to go, whoa, stop that. I don't know what you mean by that. And I could explain it. He basically asks the questions that the listeners are thinking, but he's able to do that right there so I can answer them on the podcast. And it just worked really, really well. So it immediately made it more engaging. And then obviously having him involved as someone who's got however many million Twitter followers and this big reach just meant that it could, people who were interested could hear about it, which when you're starting out, you can make the best content in the world, but if people don't know it's out there, then it's really hard to get listeners. So just having that ability for people to find out about it was absolutely invaluable. I feel very lucky. And it definitely took me a little bit by surprise just how popular it was so quickly, because it did end up in the top 10 of the iTunes chart when it was first released, which was quite overwhelming because I sort of thought it would be a bit of a slow burner, and that it would kind of word of mouth, or it would sort of trickle out. And the good thing about it is it's not really time sensitive, so people are still coming back to it. And the first episode, which was about cannabis, is still the most downloaded one, so people are coming and listening to it and starting at the beginning.
Right.
But we're over 1.25 million listens now on Say Why to Drugs, so it's pretty amazing.
Is that per episode or is that
no. No, that's in total. Yeah. But still, it's really gratifying to know that it is useful for people.
That's still incredible, though. That's amazing. I was talking to my producer the other day because we tend to check the stats a bit. And we always say that it's a marathon, not a sprint. So it's, like you said about the slow burner thing, you've obviously been very lucky to tap into Scroobius Pip's orbit, I guess, of podcast dominance. But for many podcasts, it's going to be a marathon and not a sprint. And that we're trying to get, as many interesting episodes, variety, get the back catalogue so people can really...
Well, I like that when I listen to podcasts. I really like finding one and finding out it's got a big back catalogue and then being able to go back.
Right.
That's kind of how I listen to podcasts. It's very rare that you start at the beginning, is it? So
no, that's true, actually. I started at the beginning of you, but you do tend to... You jump in at your interest point and then backtrack, don't you?
Exactly, yeah. So it's really nice to have a wide back catalogue that people can dip into, definitely.
And tell me about the book.
Yeah, so the book kind of came out of the podcast. It's also called Say Why to Drugs, but I was able to go into a lot more detail about a lot more substances in the book. And it was so fun and interesting researching it as well, because one of the things that I never did in the podcast that I've been able to do in the book is look at the history of a lot of these substances. And it's amazing how many started off as sort of medications.
Right.
And in fact, it's amazing how many drugs that we think of as sort of recreational drugs, or I don't really like the term, but drugs of abuse, are also medications. Like ketamine is on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. It's an incredibly useful anaesthetic. But it's also a potentially quite dangerous recreational drug, which can lead to sort of bladder problems and all sorts of things. And I just found the history of cocaine is incredibly interesting as well. And so reading up about all these different substances and looking at them in a much broader way than I was able to do in the past was really amazing. Launching a book during a pandemic is less good, I've got to be honest. All of my book events have been cancelled, as you might expect. But writing it was really fun. I did get to see it in a shop before we went into lockdown, so that was something.
So you can add author to your list of titles now.
Yeah.
That feels...
Published author, yeah, it's very good.
I bet that feels good. So what's the plan with the book? I know it's obviously going to be a commercial venture, but are there plans to get these into schools? Are they being added to, I guess there's some sort of national library association thing. I guess there's like books that are made sure in every library. Is it going down that route?
It's definitely in lots of libraries that I know about at the moment. I'd love to get it into schools. I think that would be really amazing. And I've had quite a few parents and teachers get in touch with me to say that it's really useful. I know that there's a few universities who do addiction modules as part of their psychology degree, and a few of them have told me that they've added it to their reading lists for the students, so that's really good. I know it's in the University of Liverpool's library, because a couple of students have tweeted going, I was the first person to get it out of the library, which is really exciting. So yeah, it's available sort of in all the usual bookshoppy places, but it's really good to know that it's being read by people who are finding it useful.
Right.
Yeah. And
do you think there'd be any parents that would be against the book going to school? Because it's so pragmatic, isn't it, about drugs, and it's not necessarily a finger pointy like say no to drugs kind of thing, is it? It's way more like, here, be informed, make your own decision, which I think to a lot of parents is going to scare the shit out of them.
I think to some parents. And so a couple of years ago now, I was invited to a school to give a talk. And the way that this school did it is that the person, and this was true of everyone, it wasn't just because of the topic, the person who they'd invited gave the talk to the parents the evening before, and then gave the talk to the students the next day. And so I gave the talk that I was going to give to the students to their parents.
Right. And
almost entirely really, really positive response, because at no point am I saying taking drugs is a good idea. Like the risks of substance use is very much front and center in the book. But I'm not naive enough to say that we should try and aim for a drug-free world or tell people not to do something. The idea is people are going to experiment with drugs. So the way to make them as safe as possible, or as least harmful as possible, is to give people as accurate information as we can, harm reduction information, how to use these substances in the least risky way.
Yeah.
So start off with really small doses in a safe environment. Don't mix substances with other substances, that kind of thing. That's the way to, without glamorizing these substances and saying that they're amazing and that they'll make you feel incredible, but also not ignoring the fact that people do take drugs because of the experience of taking drugs. That's why people do it. Most parents really got on board with that message, but there was a couple, or in fact, it might even only have been one, but someone came up to me afterwards and said, I really feel uncomfortable that you're saying that alcohol is worse than MDMA. And I was like, well, I'm not really saying it's worse than MDMA. I'm saying it's, in our society at the moment, it's more harmful, and maybe that's because a lot more people use it.
Right.
But their point was, my son will then be able to sort of say, but you're using drugs, you're having alcohol, and that was what this person really took umbrage with, that I called alcohol a drug.
Right.
And I was like, but alcohol is a drug. It's a psychoactive substance in exactly the same way that all of these other drugs we're talking about are psychoactive substances. If anything, it impacts on a wider range of neurotransmitters in the brain. So alcohol has a really wide-ranging effect in our brain. And we can see this by the sort of what alcohol intoxication is like. It's kind of, one minute we feel really alert and the next minute we might be falling asleep. It impacts on our judgment. It impacts on our ability to conduct sort of fine motor movement. It impacts on our reaction time. It's a pretty powerful drug, and yet it's the drug that's kind of societally accepted. And so we really minimize in our own heads, I think, some of the risks from alcohol. And particularly compared to drugs that we think, well, these drugs are illegal, so they must be more risky or more harmful, when actually a lot of the risks and potential harms from illicit drugs come from the fact that they're illicit. So we have no control over the quality, the potency, the dose, even knowing what they are. If you get a white powder or a white tablet, it could be almost anything.
Yeah.
And so how do you know what it is you're taking? How do you know how strong it is? You're putting yourself at much greater risk from taking an illicit substance because of this lack of regulation. While with alcohol, even where we know how strong alcohol is, and it's written on the side of every bottle of alcohol, how the alcohol content and how many doses are in there, or how many units, even though we know all this information, we still quite often misjudge how much alcohol we intend to have and drink more than we intend to, and experience the negative effects of doing so. I'm sure we've all had hangovers that we weren't expecting, that kind of thing, or we've all gone out for one and then come home at 3 a.m. going, whoops. So this idea that alcohol is somehow more benign compared to other substances is a myth that I'm really keen to dispel.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you're right that some parents do find that quite challenging. But I think, well, in my experience of speaking to parents and young people, I think most would rather that their children had good quality information for them to help them make informed decisions, that doesn't kind of sugarcoat anything really, or mislead. Because I remember when I was at school, it was very much just say no, as you say, and it was kind of presented that all drugs were the same.
Right.
All drugs are bad, and so all drugs are the same. And really, drugs have all sorts of different effects, and it becomes you lose the credibility if you say all drugs are the same, because as soon as someone or their friend has experienced one substance, and quite often that would be cannabis to start with, and gone, but I'm not addicted to it. I don't feel like I need to have it every day. It hasn't made me go mad, or it hasn't fundamentally altered me. It made me a bit giggly and a bit hungry, and maybe I was sick or whatever. But then I was fine the next day. And once you have that kind of drugs are bad message disproved, then it's much easier to say, well, maybe MDMA is fine, maybe cocaine is fine, maybe heroin is fine, because they lied about cannabis. So I think giving people more accurate information in terms of education is really, really important.
And what you're coming up against there with that particular parent is science clashing with a deep ingrained culture.
Yeah, we have such a weird relationship with alcohol, particularly in the UK. So I just saw on Twitter about Wales going into lockdown, and apparently their I don't know about the accuracy of this because this was a tweet, so it might be an urban legend, but this tweet said, in terms of supermarkets only being allowed to sell essential items, wine has been deemed an essential item, underwear not an essential item. So I think that says a lot about our relationship with alcohol in this country.
Yes, that's actually kind of, that's the social commentary there, isn't it?
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to mention with the anxiety of this particular parent is that obviously they're aware that they have a teenage child who isn't fully developed yet and is going to make mistakes and is going to not think about things fully. And there's a fear there, isn't there? Because if you give someone all the information to make an informed choice, like they're an adult, like they're an autonomous being with their own, free will, etc., that I can understand how that would make some parents anxious, because especially if you've got a kid who's a bit of a free spirit, bit of a wild child, whatever, you're not always sure what they're up to and you don't like the look of their mates or whatever. Do you know what I mean? And then suddenly they get this information where it's like, oh, well, I could do this as long as I only do half a pill or something like that. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of scary for parents, I think, because in a way I feel like it takes away some of their parental control to be able to say, oh, it's all bad, it's the boogeyman and this and that.
Yeah, I completely take that point, and I should point out as well that I would never say to a group of children sort of, this is the dose that is safe or anything like that, because for a start, I don't think that's true. I don't think there is a safe dose of things, and there are risks.
Perhaps I put words in your mouth then. Sorry.
No, it's fine, but I think it's an important point, because that might be what people are thinking, and that's definitely not the case. I wouldn't do a talk like that, and I wouldn't sort of say, because no drugs are safe, but that's true of alcohol, that's true of tobacco. Obviously, I mean, alcohol and tobacco are two of the particularly harmful drugs in terms of risk to health in the UK population and globally as well. And maybe that's partly because they're used by so many people, but also they are particularly damaging drugs as well. But no drugs are safe and no drugs are without harm. But when I do these talks, I talk about what we know about the harms, but also saying where we don't know. So things like the link between cannabis and psychosis, for example, that's what I did my PhD exploring. And what I quickly realised is the link is definitely there. They're very strongly associated, or not even actually very strongly associated, but there is an association between heavy cannabis use and an increased risk of psychosis or psychotic-like experiences. But to say that is causal is much, much harder. And also the extent to which everyone is at risk is unclear. Right. Because cannabis use is fairly common, psychosis is fairly rare. So it's definitely not the case that everyone who uses cannabis every day even is going to develop psychosis. However, it does look like if you have other risk factors as well, then cannabis could be one more thing that puts you at further risk of developing what is a very serious and debilitating mental health problem. Yeah. So it's really important to kind of get that nuance across, I think, because for most people who use cannabis, they're not going to have any problems with their mental health at all. But the people who do have problems could have really, really severe problems. So what we really need to do as researchers is better understand, well, who is particularly at risk and why. And I think the reason cannabis quite often gets most of the blame for psychosis is because other risk factors happen earlier in life, or they're not quite as visible. Whereas if you're going to develop psychosis, you tend to develop it in late adolescence or early adulthood, which is also just when you're likely to first use cannabis or start using cannabis. Right. And so these two things happened temporally very close together. So maybe that is why that link is seen as particularly strong. But also alcohol use predicts increased risk of psychosis as well. And again, most people who use alcohol won't develop psychosis, but some people will, and potentially that's at least in part because of their alcohol use. Right. So it's it's really complicated and really nuanced. And so trying to sort of get that across, I think, is really important. But it is important to talk about the limitations of what we know as well, rather than just sort of saying as some kind of authority figure, if you do this, then this will happen to you. Because it probably won't, but it might.
Yeah.
And yeah, it is difficult when you're a teenager, I think, to make those decisions, because you feel quite kind of invincible when you're a teenager as well, and you're almost programmed to take risks. Like that's an important part of learning.
And peer pressure
in teenage years, and peer pressure as well. But one of the things I always say, particularly when talking about cannabis use, is we know that the risks are greater the younger that you are, partly because we know that your brain is still developing until you're about 25, and there are receptors in your brain called endocannabinoid receptors, because our brains make a type of cannabinoid.
Right.
They don't make, it's not THC, like it's not one you find in the cannabis plant, but that's why when you consume cannabis, it has a reaction in your brain, because our brains, there are certain receptors that are kind of the right shape for the cannabis molecules to fit in.
Right.
I mean, that's an oversimplification,
right.
but that's basically the gist of it.
That is fascinating.
And those receptors are developing during adolescence. So if you flood your brain with extra cannabinoids, potentially that could alter the development of those receptors, because if there's more of them there, then maybe the receptors will, the number of receptors will change to represent or to reflect the increased number of these cannabinoid molecules in your brain.
Right.
And also then when you look at the outcomes, the risks are greater if you start using cannabis at a younger age. That's more heavily associated with negative outcomes than if you start using it as an adult or later. So that's a really important message that you can give to teenagers, of say, you've got your whole lives ahead of you. You don't need to try these things now. Wait until you've finished this bit of brain development. And if you are going to then use, it's much less risky to do so after you're, say, 25.
Right.
I mean, there are still risks, but the risks go down, and the risks are much higher right now at the age you are at. And so that's a kind of bit of information that you can give quite easily, I think.
And so if your brain has a cannabinoid, am I saying that right? Cannabinoid shaped receptor in it. Does that mean, it doesn't mean that you suppose it's there for cannabis, but what's it there for? If it's in the cannabinoid shape, what is its purpose there?
So our bodies make what's called an endocannabinoid. It's called anandamide, I think. So our brains have lots of what are called neurotransmitters, and they are the chemicals that send messages between our brain cells. So our brain cells aren't directly connected to each other. There's a little gap between each brain cell, and for a signal to fire across the gap, it gets to the end of one brain cell, triggers the release of a chemical, which then binds to these receptors on the other side, which then sends the signal further on. Again, a gross oversimplification, but that's kind of the gist of it. And so we have loads and loads of different neurotransmitters that are all involved in different processes. So you might have heard of dopamine, serotonin, noradrenaline. There's all sorts of neurotransmitters. There's one called GABA, which you may or may not have heard of. But
I only know GABA is in the sort of heavy industrial German. Any links between the name and the...
I mean, I've wondered the same thing myself, but I'm not sure. But I think like dopamine and serotonin in particular, lots of us will have heard of. Anandamide, which is this endocannabinoid, is just another one of these neurotransmitters that our brains or bodies make to pass these messages across. And in fact, that's how most recreational drugs work. Alcohol works like this too. Psychedelics work like this. They are either very similar in shape to pre-existing neurotransmitters, or they interfere with the levels of neurotransmitters in some way. So some of them will bind to receptors blocking other neurotransmitters. So MDMA, for example, is linked to serotonin and can alter the levels of serotonin. Lots of substances, interact with dopamine, because dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's sort of related to things like reward and experiencing pleasure. Opioids are very similar to our endorphins, so that's why opioids can lead to feelings of pleasure, that kind of thing. So these molecules are very similar shapes to existing neurotransmitters in our brain, and that's how they
work so well,
how they have their effect in the brain.
Right.
So it's not that our brains have evolved to respond to cannabis. It's that our bodies already do these processes, and the molecules are just similar shapes.
We're sort of predisposed to them in a way.
Either it's a coincidence or, but for some reason and that's kind of why they have their psychoactive effects, because they have an effect in the brain, because they're this particular shape, and so they can alter the firing of our brain or the levels of our neurotransmitters.
So earlier you mentioned that other drug use, and you said that, potentially or quite often it starts with cannabis. There is an old, and I thought it was a cliche or a mistruth, but cannabis a gateway drug in your opinion, or not? And I'm sorry, you're probably so bored of hearing that. But...
No, I think it's an important question. I would say I don't think there's anything specific about cannabis itself biologically that makes it a gateway drug. And I think that most people, not everyone, but most people, when they try cannabis, will already have tried alcohol and will probably already have tried tobacco, nicotine.
Yeah.
So if anything is the gateway drug, it's probably one of those two.
Yeah.
Maybe. But I think the reason cannabis quite often gets called a gateway drug is because it is seen as maybe a little bit less risky than some other substances. But it's also that step into kind of breaking the law. So it's the first substance that most people try where they're doing something illicit. Although having said that, most people first try alcohol when they're underage, and most people first try cigarettes when they're underage. So that's not necessarily strictly true either. They are slightly doing something illicit. And I'm saying illicit rather than illegal, because the law is very complicated, and using a substance isn't necessarily illegal, but possession and selling and that kind of thing are. So it's sort of a bit complicated. So I'm trying to kind of avoid confusing terminology. But I don't think cannabis itself is a gateway drug. And in fact, when I was doing my PhD, my friend was doing her PhD looking at the evidence for cannabis as a gateway drug, and it's pretty poor. But maybe it's it's likely to be the first illicit drug that you try. Maybe it's the first thing that you do that puts you in contact with someone who sells illicit drugs. And once you're in contact with someone who sells illicit drugs, then it's easier to then get other illicit drugs. Right. So maybe that makes that more likely. Yeah. So I don't think there's anything specific about cannabis itself that makes it a gateway drug in terms of biology, but in terms of sort of the social or environmental aspects, then it probably is the next one on the path. But lots of people try cannabis and never try any other illicit drugs. And there are plenty of people who try other illicit drugs who've never tried cannabis as well. So it's definitely not a sort of...
And it's also down to that openness as well, like we talked about with the musicians being creative. I mean, if you're smoking cannabis, then it means you've already been open to one experience, which is I don't want to say mind altering, but psychoactive, as you said.
Yeah.
And so you're already a few degrees open to this experience, aren't you? So
exactly, yeah.
So I'm the deputy mayor of Frome at the moment, and I also work in a store, like a co-op, right, in the centre of the town. And during lockdown, when people were furloughed and staying at home, trying to do the lockdown, I noticed just how bad the town's drug and alcohol problems were. And I did see some people slide into them as well through a daily thing. What are the, not a thing, like a decline, like, as you see someone's regression or progression into this habit or issue. Is there any data at the moment that's reflecting this? Because I noticed the way I saw it is that a lot of people went home, so that there was loads of people who were suffering from addictions and were out and about because they had to steal and they had to try and make their money to sort of score their drugs or whatever, just the same as they would in a pre-lockdown situation. But because everyone had gone home, they were very conspicuous because of that, and it just hammered home just how many people actually are suffering and in a bad place. What's the data looking like for this sort of period of our history?
Yeah, I think this is something that a lot of people are really interested in. So we've done some research looking at alcohol use, and there's been quite a few papers published. Ours isn't out yet, but hopefully it will be soon, around changing relationships with alcohol during the lockdown. And that seems to be people have gone one of two ways. People who didn't drink, I mean, this is again at a population level, and there'll be lots of individual differences within that. But what seems to be coming out in the data is that people who didn't drink as much have started drinking less, and people who were drinking more have started drinking even more. So kind of the divide has gone further.
Right.
But again, that's only some quite preliminary data at the moment, but a few different data sets have shown this pattern, which is quite interesting. In terms of other drug use, I've worked on a paper with some colleagues, which isn't out yet, so I don't know how much I can talk about it, but it's under review at the moment, so we're hoping that it will get published soon. But we looked at online forums to people talking about their substance use and how lockdown and COVID have affected it. And we did some qualitative analysis to try and pull out different themes that were coming from the data. And we found some really interesting things, like for some people, the lack of structure was really, really risky for them. So particularly people who've been furloughed. Lots of people who are sort of coming out the other side of drug dependence have a lot of coping strategies in place. And those might be things like meeting someone or going for a walk.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
When those kind of options are taken away from you, that can be really, really difficult. If your support network can no longer access you and you can feel very isolated, then that could be a real trigger for slipping back into problematic behaviours or problematic patterns of behaviour. But conversely, people who are quite isolated and weren't able to attend things like AA and NA meetings have gone online in a lot of places. And while that's been very difficult for some people, it's actually made access easier for other people who find it difficult to physically get to meetings. So what our results really highlighted was the importance of these individual differences, and why one size fits all kind of treatments for people with drug dependence or problematic drug use don't really work, is because everyone has such different needs and different circumstances. And actually, we can probably do a lot more if we were able to be more responsive. I mean, the difficult thing at the moment is that all these services in the past few years have been really cut. The funding to them has been really cut. And so while we're here advising that people, that we should be doing more tailored and bespoke treatments, the money for that just isn't there at the moment. And it's something we really, really need as a society to look at, is how to support people much better, because at the moment we're pretty bad at supporting people.
And it was a difficult situation to be in, watching this happen in real time, because I had to juggle two hats. I've had the local town councillor, deputy mayor role, and then I've got my employee role. And it's, I've been stuttering a little bit and not getting my words out quite right during this pod, because I want to pick my words wisely, and I don't want to sound like I'm judging anyone or damning anything. And I definitely don't want to come across as ignorant. But so I'm picking what I say wisely, so I'm not misrepresenting anything. But so you've got one side of the coin is this guy's coming in every day and he's robbing steaks and cheese to sell door to door or whatever, or give to his dealer in lieu of money. And you have to say, oh, get out, don't come back. But at the same time, you don't hate this guy, and you feel for him, and you kind of get that, you get his plight. So I've got this weird thing of like, right, I've got this social responsibility with being a town councillor and a member of the community, but then I've also got this other thing where I'm sort of tethered to this sort of paycheck in this corporate, not quite corporate where I am, but this entity. And it was a really hard thing to juggle. And it really was, it really troubled me. And I ended up writing a piece, a mayor's view for the local paper. And I tell you what, during such a time of sort of divided politics, when that piece came out about, there is a dark side to this hip town that everyone's putting in the newspapers, in the Guardian and whatnot, is the coolest hole ever. There is a dark side that people don't always talk about. And that was received almost overwhelmingly. And I realized that this is an issue that unites both sides of the, I guess not everything can be political, but this unites all corners of society in that, there's a lot of people out there that really do care about the fabric of society, and they're not letting these people drift off in the fringes and suffer. And it was really quite powerful. I'll email you the thing afterwards, but what would your advice be to someone like me who has to juggle these responsibilities, some social leadership, but also having to understand that there's a consequence to drug-related crime?
I mean, first, I guess I should say that's a little bit out of my kind of area of expertise. I'm very much about the sort of
the science, the
population level science, rather than policy or the sort of criminal side of things as well. What I would say is, I think what you've said there is incredibly powerful. And the thing so we did a couple of pieces of research recently, myself and some colleagues at Liverpool John Moores University, looking at stigma and the impact of stigma on people who use drugs and on perceptions of people who use drugs. And what we found was that when personal, humanizing, true stories were presented alongside the evidence around sort of how people ended up in difficult circumstances, for example, or speaking to families who've lost loved ones through substance use, when those stories were incorporated alongside evidence, people showed so much more sort of compassion and understanding and support for harm reduction measures around substance use. So one of the papers we published was looking at introduction of drug consumption rooms in Scotland, specifically for people who inject drugs, and as a kind of cleaner place for someone to inject a drug rather than having to do it sort of clandestinely in a potentially sort of disgusting conditions with unsterile equipment. So these consumption rooms are somewhere sort of clean and safe that someone can go. And they're used in all sorts of other countries and shown there's a lot of evidence for their efficacy. But politically in this country, or in Scotland, and maybe more so in the UK as a whole, there's not very much political will to support them. I think partly because people feel there's a feeling that it's not a vote winner kind of thing. But what we found was that in a representative sample of the Scottish population, just in general, the majority of people who were interviewed were broadly supportive, and they became more supportive when we provided sort of evidence, but alongside humanizing stories. So I think what you're saying about your article, it sounds like it really hit a nerve, because it reminded people that we're talking about human lives here. We're talking about people who are really struggling, and anything that we can do to kind of help can be really powerful. And I think that's where this kind of criminal side comes into it as well, because these people are suffering, their health is suffering, their relationships are suffering, and on top of that, they're at risk for sort of criminal factors as well. So I think if we can make substance use more of a health issue than a criminal issue, I think that takes one angle of this pressure off people who are really struggling.
Do you think we're likely to see a move in that direction under our current government?
Honestly, I really don't know.
I know you're a scientist, not a politician.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it's something that I've spoken about a lot. So I've just recorded a podcast with an organisation called Transform that's going out next week, I think, and they've just written a paper about what a regulated stimulant market would look like. This report came out earlier this week. They wrote one about cannabis a few years ago, and actually now we are around the world seeing cannabis regulation happening in some countries, like some states in the US, like Canada is being debated in New Zealand at the moment, Uruguay. So it's quite a range of different countries as well. And I never thought I'd see that when I first started this research looking at cannabis. I never thought that would happen. And I think in the UK, there's so much else going on that these kind of issues are pushed way down the agenda. But having said that, we have seen discussions about medicinal use of cannabis, which is obviously a slightly different issue. But conversations are happening around that. Changes in legislation are happening, albeit at a very slow pace and not necessarily that accessible for many people. But maybe once the sort of big political events that are happening at the moment are, I mean, I don't know whether Brexit's ever going to be done, but maybe like once it's stopped being the primary topic of conversation, things like this will be more able to be discussed. And in terms of what political party in this country would do it, I don't know the answer. But there are now drug policy working groups. The Green Party have one, the Labour Party have one, the Conservative Party have one. So there are politicians across the political spectrum talking about these issues. So yeah,
Who knows?
I mean, I don't know. Who knows exactly?
We can hope for the best, can't we? So earlier when I mentioned that I potentially had put words in your mouth with the school thing. Sorry about that. What I was referring to was as I've listened to so many of your podcasts in the last 24 hours that they've not all melded into one, but there's a little bit. And I think where I was getting that from was from the bonus episode with the drugs group within Bristol, where that was the information that they were sort of promoting to people of that age. Not yourself, sorry. That was from those guys. That was a really great episode.
No, that's fine. Yeah, Bristol Drugs Project do amazing work in Bristol, and they are quite often at clubs like Motion, giving that kind of harm reduction advice to people who are using substances at that time. So it's not so much, they wouldn't necessarily give that advice in schools, but they would give it to people who are out clubbing, who are telling them that they're going to be using substances. So it's things like, don't be daft, start with a half, crush, dab, wait. And it's particularly important because MDMA is so potent at the moment. Organisations like The Loop, who have also worked in Bristol, who do drug testing, and by drug testing, I mean, they don't test you to see whether you've taken drugs. They test your drugs to tell you what they are and how strong they are. And they have been finding at festivals in the UK and city centre testing that MDMA is really, really potent at the moment. Cocaine is really, really potent at the moment. So a dose that you might have had 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that was an adequate dose for you. If you take the same amount, you might be taking twice as much actual MDMA.
Wow.
So, or even more than that potentially. So it's definitely advisable to start small.
MDMA is so popular. I mean, I'm quite a grizzled sort of festival veteran now, having worked sort of the last sort of, I don't know how many, 5 Glastonburys or whatever, and had been a festival goer before that. First festival I ever went to was Isle of Wight Festival. I think that was back in 2014. And I came back going, wow, everyone was so nice. It was so, and I think back to it now, it's such like an in-betweeners moment. Do you know what I mean? But it was like so naive. God, everyone was just having such a great time. Everyone was so nice.
To be fair, most people at festivals aren't on drugs. The majority of people at festivals are not on drugs. That doesn't mean there aren't lots of people on drugs at festivals, but it's probably less common than you might think.
Right. But yeah, it's funny once you get a little wise to this, and you start to see the jaws swinging and the gurning and the look in the eyes,
the size of people's pupils.
Yeah. And then you realise, oh, I see what's going on here. But that's an interesting world to be in, actually, for a week. It's just it's almost like seas of people who all look almost exactly the same. Because
oh, I miss festivals so much.
Yeah, they're so receptive to music as well.
I was really hoping to make it to Glastonbury this year for the first time ever. Given I lived in Bristol for 12 years, I can't believe I never went to Glastonbury. No.
Oh, Glastonbury.
I missed out.
So when people say, oh, Glastonbury, there's something about it, there's a magic in the air, blah, 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 and you think, oh, yeah, whatever, it's just because you're on holiday and your favourite bands are there and whatever. No, there is really something about the place besides the music, because Glastonbury can be something other than a music festival. That's how big and diverse it is. But it really is, and I'm not into ley lines or any of that. I don't really kind of get that stuff. Like I mean, if the hippies want to talk about it at the festival, and I'm more than happy to listen and get behind it and stuff there. But it's not really my kind of science. But there is something truly magical about Glastonbury. And I think you definitely need to go. As soon as live music's back, if you can get a ticket.
Yeah. Well, what I was trying to do was get a book talk and come and talk about Say Why to Drugs at Glastonbury. I think that would be brilliant.
That would go down so well.
If anyone's listening to this, please book me. I would love to.
I guess I got one final question for you, I guess. And I don't want this to be, you don't have to answer it. We do have edit control. So if you want it gone, we can just get rid of it. But obviously you're pregnant. You're about to become a mother. Do you know what you're having yet?
Nope. Decided not to find out. Yeah.
No? Oh, surprise. Okay. So knowing what you know about drugs and the fact that you're going to have a child soon who's one day going to be in that age group, what advice, what sort of approach are you going to be taking? Or maybe you don't even know, you might be, because we change, don't we? So you're going to be someone different in 15, 20 years than you are now. But what would you like to think your approach would be to that conversation with your child or children?
It's a really good question, and it's something that I have thought about a lot, and there's some really good advice out there. So there's a researcher and he's a clinician called Owen Bowden-Jones, and he's written a book called How to Talk to Your Children About Drugs, and it's some really, really good advice in there for parents. And I think the key, which is what you said there, is a conversation. You don't want to just have you don't want to just have the drugs chat. What I want is to have an environment where my child can talk to me about these kind of things, feels that I would be open to listening in a non-judgmental way and being able to sort of trust me with things that they want to talk about. And yeah, it's really difficult because you don't know what your child is going to be like. And I think there does have to be that kind of nuance that different children will need or want this conversation at very different ages. Some will be very sort of streetwise and will learn about these things at a very young age, whereas others will be much more will take a much longer time to come across this kind of conversation.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't want to rush a child into it, but equally I wouldn't want it to get to a point where they've done all of their finding out about it without me knowing about it or without talking to them about it. I guess, given the research that I do, the child is probably going to realise from quite a young age that I know about these kind of things. Yeah. So maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a bad thing. I don't really know.
Yeah.
But what my ideal would be to provide a safe environment where they feel like they can confide in me, that they're not going to get sort of told off, or I'm not going to be kind of draconian about these things. I'm going to be honest. I'm going to be supportive and helpful, and that we can talk about these things and we can carry on conversations. It's not a one-off thing that's really awkward and then we never speak of it again kind of thing, but it's an ongoing dialogue that as they mature, so does our conversation. That's what I hope for.
And of course, in 15 to 20 years, the drugs landscape will be different.
Exactly,
because the drugs might be 4 times as strong now, as you said, if they're carrying on this trajectory of being. Because I know people who have been in the rave scene in the 90s, and then they've come to festivals or whatever with us in their later, not later years, in their sort of late 30s, and they've dabbled again for the first time in however long. And they're like, oh my God, it's nothing like I remember.
Yeah.
So things are going to progress again, aren't they? And maybe I'm being ignorant, but something like spice or bath salts or something, are these sort of new drugs, or do they just become part of the media machine at a certain point? So where do you think drugs are going to go? What do you think the drug will be in 15 years? Maybe people will think cocaine is whack and it'll be something else.
It's a great question, because I think a lot will depend on, whether anything happens in terms of regulation and trying to change the way that we treat illicit drugs. What's the really worrying patterns is over the last couple of years, drug deaths have been going up, which is odd because drug use hasn't really been going up. If anything, in some populations it's been going down, and yet more people are dying. So something is going badly wrong. So I really hope that well before we get to 15, 20 years' time, we put the brakes on that and do something about these changing patterns in these increasing deaths and increasing potencies and things like that. I don't know what that will look like. And as you say, different drugs appear, particularly recently, things like synthetic cannabinoids like spice and synthetic cathinones like bath salts, mephedrone, that kind of thing. These are sort of synthetic chemical approximations of other substances. And so there's also, that's been happening with psychedelics as well. So things like 2CB, you're seeing tweaking of molecules to create new substances. That could carry on. Then maybe there'll be completely different substances discovered. Who knows? I think it's more likely that things will be created, synthesized, rather than discovered in the natural world. Right. But who knows? Maybe drugs will all be legalized. They'll become deeply uncool, and young people won't want anything to do with them. Who knows? It could be anything. So yeah, I'm not very good at predicting the future.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of The Giant Pod. That was Dr. Suzi Gage. If you've been affected by anything that we've discussed within this podcast, we will leave links for help and advice, additional information, etc. in the show note descriptions, as well as links to the Say Why to Drugs podcast, the Say Why to Drugs book, and any other relevant links. Please subscribe, leave a review. It really does mean a lot. You can follow my antics on Instagram at Andy_S1S. This podcast was produced by the effervescent Harry Williams. Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode of The Giant Pod. We will be back next week. Thanks.